Hi, welcome back. I hope you all are having a great start to your semester and your classes are going well. I really enjoyed the discussion posts and meeting you all that way last week. This week we're going to talk about primary sources and historical thinking skills. Many people still tend to think that history is just a series of facts and details that you need to memorize. And we start off rattling factoids at the beginning of class, depending on the level of the class, and then move to the end of time or the end of the semester. And that's an impression I think a lot of people still have, that history is taught that way. Well, some of us definitely love those details, and I am one of those. History is more about investigation and investigating the past. It's about comparing stories and perspectives. Studying history matters not just to learn about the past, but to prepare us for the present, to prepare us for the challenges we face in our own world. Every day we face issues, and we need to evaluate evidence before us to make decisions about those issues. These can include public issues, such as questions about rights or laws, and private issues, such as questions about your health or your personal welfare. The techniques that historians use, the critical thinking skills, can help you throughout your life and not just while you are in school. So I know a lot of you are not into history, or not historians, or not future historians, but I want to encourage you to think about this as a broader skill set that you'll be learning than just learning about facts of history. Before we get into the historical thinking skills that are the skills that historians use, we need to understand their sources. Historians use primary sources to help them understand the past, and they ask questions about those primary sources. So we need to know, what are primary sources? So primary sources are the first-hand accounts of a time period. A historian of the future, looking back at our time period, looking back at the 2010s, will have a lot of primary sources to work with. And I'll show you some examples of the primary sources that historians of the future will have. So the primary sources of the early 2000s or of the 2010s could be, for example, a speech by German Chancellor Angela Merkel, especially if you're studying U.S.-German relations with this one, because this was a speech she gave in front of the U.S. Congress. You might look at, if you're studying culture, a YouTuber site. So somebody in our post mentioned Only One Jess, who is a YouTuber from now, and you could look at her site to see how she's talking about particular kinds of culture. And there are others that you mentioned, YouTubers that you mentioned. Or you could look at a famous photo of Aisha Evans, if an historian is wanting to look at the Black Lives Matter movement and analyze the Black Lives Matter movement. So just to reiterate, primary sources are the first-hand accounts, or close to first-hand accounts, from the time period. We will look at a variety of these sources throughout our course. Moreover, these differ from secondary sources, or sources written after the fact, usually many years later. So an example of a secondary source would be a scholarly source about the Black Lives Matter movement 5 or 10, 15 years from now. That's going to be a secondary source if it's a scholarly article analyzing what happened during the Black Lives Matter movement. So I hope that gives you a starting point for primary sources. We will talk about them more as we go through the course, and I'll also link to a video that you can watch from the library that will talk more about the differences between primary and secondary sources, if you feel like you need that more. Ultimately, as I said, historians ask questions. So the 4 types of questions that we ask are critical and will follow you throughout this semester. So make sure you get to know them well. I'm going to go through the 4 skills now and then demonstrate them to you as we go. So the first skill is sourcing. Sourcing asks questions like, what is the primary source's attribution? Where is it from? When is it from? Who is the author? How is it created? What was their motivation? Who was their intended audience? So if we look at the Aisha Evans photo taking a stand in Baton Rouge, this is an interesting image to think about. And because it's an iconic image, it evokes a feeling because of what we're seeing there. It's very striking because of the difference in the pose and the clothing. We make assumptions based on our own experience about the world. So as historians, our job is to ask questions about the past to move beyond our assumptions. If we're looking at the Evans photo, we would ask who the photographer was, which company he worked for, what was his assignment that day, what was he asked to do by his company. So the photographer, and these are all sourcing questions, and the photographer was Jonathan Bachman. He worked for Reuters, so we should ask what kind of business Reuters is in. And it's from 9th of July 2016. Second, contextualizing situates the document in time and place. So what's the date again? We could look at the date. What were the conditions of that date? Under what conditions was this created? What was happening that set in motion the conditions under which this photo could be taken? A key point for contextualization is try to avoid presentist thinking. I talked about this last week. So in other words, we try to avoid applying ideas and concerns from the present to the historical time period. So we don't want to take the ideas and notions we have now about life and just automatically apply them to the past. We also want to have a clear understanding of what else was happening in context. If there is social change at the time, or a revolution, or a war, for example, what's going on in the social context? For the Evans photo, we are looking at a protest in Baton Rouge on 9th of July 2016. We know that the protest was about the death of Alton Sterling by a police shooting. We can assume that Louisiana was hot that day because it is usually hot in the summer, but we could look and then see what the weather was like that day. That might help us understand a little bit about what people are feeling, especially if it's hot and humid and they're standing outside for long periods of time. It gives us a sense of what the context the actors are in that particular moment. Third, we have close reading. So close reading looks at the key phrases and how words are used, especially in narrative text or written text. So this will ask what was said, what words did the author use, and what was left unsaid. Now you can read photos too, and probably, so I have some art students in this class, so you probably will be very good at doing this. The photographer probably I'm sure took multiple photographs on the same day. So why is this one so iconic? What about it makes it so iconic? Many commentators have remarked about the contrast between Aisha's flowing dress and the combat gear of the police officers. So thinking, you can read photos looking at the way people are dressed, the poses that they're taking, the way that Aisha is standing very erect and holding her arms out in front of her, right? Those are the ways that you can read a photo. Finally, we have corroboration or corroborating. So corroborating is comparing documents against one another. In what ways do two or more differing accounts give different perspectives? And you notice here, I'm not asking in what ways is one right versus one wrong. We're not necessarily looking true and false. We're looking for perspectives. So what perspectives do we see in these accounts? And do they agree or disagree? And in what ways do they agree or disagree? So bringing us back to Aisha's image, in order to really understand this image, we need to know what happened before and after. We need to know why Aisha, a nurse from New York City, decided to protest in Baton Rouge. And then how was she treated at this particular moment, especially when she's arrested? We do this not to discredit or second-guess the source, and certainly not to discredit or second-guess the subject of the source, in this case Aisha and the police officers, but in order to better understand what happened in that past. To do that, we could look at the image, which is on the left, and then the video, which is on the right. And the video shows what was happening both before the image and after the image. We could also read an interview with Aisha to understand how she felt in the moment. why she chose to go there, and what she was thinking at the very moment that this happened. Through these skills, we can build an understanding of what happened in the past and why. By interrogating sources, rather than just seeing them as facts or taking them at face value, we can learn a lot more about life in the past. There are always unresolved questions. We can begin creating an argument about the past. Again, these skills can be very helpful even in your personal life, and I hope you can see how. In the next video, I'm going to give you another example of this process using a historical source, a couple of sources, and then you're going to do the same thing for yourself in your historical thinking activity on those two sources. Be sure to watch the Crash Course History video before you get to my second lecture. It will help you with the contextualizing stuff. I'll see you there.